Thank you. Thanks very much. Just as a quick note, it's wonderful to be here, and just over my jet lag enough now that I think I can do this well enough. But I come to Ireland fairly frequently, and I should, as a quick personal comment, my wife being from Dublin, her father was a detective sergeant in the Dublin police force for his career, and he passed away at a young age, but I know he'd be very proud to know that I was here, invited as a guest to speak here today. And I probably learned more about transatlantic relations and Europe from him than I have from anyone that I ever met in Washington. And I should say, he also told me that the single best leader in Ireland at the time was a guy named Garrett Fitzgerald, and he was his hero, and so I'm particularly honored to see him here today. And I also want to say thanks also very quickly to Ben. Ben Tonra is a real presence in the American academic community, and a very strong presence, highly regarded. When he speaks and writes, he's listened to very carefully, and so we benefit greatly whenever you let him come to America, so the more often we can do that, the better. I'm also here in Ireland working on a new project. I'm dealing with where Ireland goes in the post-Celtic Tiger period. So if any of you have any ideas on that, let me know. I'd be glad to listen. But what we're here to do today is to talk about NATO. My central argument that I'll lay out here, I presented recently at a prominent blog page called foreignpolicy.com. It's one of the most widely read sort of websites for foreign policy discussions in the United States now, and this created some argument with regard to this group that's been looking over the NATO strategic plan. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the central concerns that I would raise, I hope constructively, and then my central argument is that the strategic concept is really not a strategic plan at all, and it hasn't done any kind of major strategic assessment of what really is the role of NATO, what's the potential value of NATO, and indeed also what are the hindrances to adjustment in the world today that NATO might actually be creating. So I want to talk about that, say a few things about Afghanistan. I'm glad to talk about General McChrystal in the Q&A, or if anyone wants to go there, we can talk about that too. And I'll close with a little bit of historical perspective. So count me as a critic, but it is difficult to come to that after several, two full decades of writing on NATO, working at NATO, very involved in NATO enlargement. I was involved in Washington in the Irish outreach on Partnership for Peace and so forth. And I have a lot of friends in NATO, people who are writing these documents and so forth. But I really have come to a basic disagreement on where this is headed in terms of NATO's future. My concern to a degree is about the process, and let me illustrate the concerns with three specific quotes. The first comes from the NATO Secretary General, Rasmussen. He says, quote, "We must face new challenges. Terrorism, proliferation, cybersecurity, or even climate change will oblige us to seek new ways of operating. And in a time of financial and budget constraints, we need to maximize our efficiency within limited resources." That's his quote. However, yet all of these are tasks that I will posit are better suited for the European Union and a special EU-US relationship, not NATO. Secondly, Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, says, quote, "This alliance has endured because of the skill of our diplomats, the strengths of our soldiers, and most importantly, the power of its founding principles." That's fair enough. That's true. But on the other hand, it's often forgotten that one of the very core reasons NATO came into existence in the first place was to provide reassurance to Western Europe so it could get back on its feet after World War II and eventually stand on its own 2 feet. As George Kennan and others warned at the time, there was a danger of creating a permanent sort of reliance by Europe on the American security guarantee. That is creating major friction right now in the alliance, especially in Afghanistan, but also on defense budgets and so forth. But one of the original goals of NATO was actually to create a circumstance where you wouldn't really need NATO in the future. Secretary of Defense Gates says, quote, "The demilitarization of Europe, where large swaths of the general public and political class are averse to military force and the risks that go with it, has gone from a blessing in the 20th century to an impediment to achieving real security and lasting peace in the 21st century." I find that I'm a very great admirer of Secretary Gates. I think he's an excellent Secretary of Defense. But I find that view, which is common now in Washington, to be frustrating at best, because if it's true that Europe is demilitarized and at peace, then mission accomplished, all right? We can put a flag on a ship even if we have to and declare victory and go home. That's a growing attitude in America, and I'll document that in just a minute. But the criticism in Washington, as I take it, is that the end result is that they view, both in the Bush administration, and I think this is carried over relative to Afghanistan, that Europe no longer fights wars. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, it doesn't have incentives to contribute equally in terms of burden sharing, to do the kinds of missions the United States wants to do, like in Afghanistan, and that NATO actually perpetuates a growing view in America NATO or is evidence of perpetuating a view that Europe is free riding on the American security promise. Okay, so that's the initial problem. But the effort right now in NATO, which is a bureaucratically driven review process, very inward, frankly, NATO coming up with more work for NATO to do. In academics, we do peer review, and we sometimes bring outside people in, but if you look at the makeup of the task force, it's a very insular group, quite frankly, of people. And one of the most frustrating things is how little attention is given both in the U.S. Defense Department's Quadrennial Defense Review and to this NATO Strategic Review document to the role of the European Union. I think that is a very big mistake, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But the strategic problem is where you should start if you're doing a plan. Well, we know that the U.S. relative economic position in the world is in dramatic decline. In fact, there's data that shows that the U.S. share of gross world product is one of the largest declines in history, relative to China coming up, and I mean, you know all about that. And so that leaves America with some basic choices. And I'm not even optimistic we'll be able to make these choices because of our politics, actually, in Washington. But with some basic choices, either to begin to retrench and pull back from our military commitments overseas in order to deal with some of our budget problems, or to continue this effort to secure the global periphery, like in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. And yet, while we're doing that, and it's consuming $708 billion a year, a total of $1 trillion now in Iraq and Afghanistan, while we're doing that, we're financing it by borrowing from China, right? That, to me, is the #1 national security challenge for America, because it's about its relative position in the world. And Secretary Clinton has said this, that the debt is a national security problem, too. Okay, so, and yet we continue to increase defense spending. We continue to increase our global commitments. The U.S. has an additional, in addition to the $708 billion defense budget, we have an additional $159 billion for overseas contingency operations. Now we're headed towards $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. Eventually, Iraq and Afghanistan, very good economic estimates suggest this will cost up to $3 trillion of the American economy. Secretary Gates has announced he wants to cut $15 billion from the defense budget, but the reason he wants to cut that is to pay for the existing operations overseas. And yet you have some people, like a good colleague and friend, Kori Schake, who was a counterpart in the McCain campaign. She advised McCain on NATO issues. She writes, quote, "Conservatives need to hearken back to our Eisenhower heritage and develop a defense leadership that understands military power is fundamentally premised on the solvency of the American government and the vibrancy of the U.S. economy." Okay, add to that, we have a significant rise in the United States of isolationism. I think it's real, it's palpable. I live in central Ohio. I hear it in the streets. You know, why are we in Afghanistan? Why are we in Iraq? Why are we bailing out banks in Europe as well as America? Why are we bailing out banks in America? You know, I mean, it's a big rise in this. The Pew surveys test a question on degree of isolationism, and 49%, which is the highest in the history of Pew surveying, say the U.S., quote, should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. We have a new defense review, which has put a heavy emphasis on partnering, but virtually says nothing about the European Union. It doesn't even say much about NATO, quite frankly. It's a much more bilateral kind of approach and building partnership capacity with the goal of eventually, though, handing off to others. I'm just going to argue that we should take that to a much higher level and begin to think about that in terms of the EU. But also, just one last point on this, the U.S. Defense Review is contradictory because it says our core mission is to extend a global defense posture comprised of forward station and rotationally deployed U.S. forces, pre-positioned equipment, and overseas facilities and international agreements. In addition to Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. is maintaining 400,000 troops ready for permanent or rotational deployment worldwide. Now, Secretary Gates said about NATO, right now the alliance faces very serious long-term problems. But these are not addressed, factored in, or realigned given the new realities of American power. That's my quote, not his. So finally, you have $13 trillion in debt. So to me, that is the strategic environment in which one has to start to even think about whether NATO has a role or what its representational role is in the transatlantic relationship and so forth. Then you've got to talk about Afghanistan, I think. And because it is a NATO operation, it's a problem. It's a real problem. Now I should say that in the debates last fall, I did some op-eds and some informal work as well as during the review. And I was quite opposed, actually, to the strategy that came out of General McChrystal. Ironically, I supported it before I opposed it. I was supportive of it back in 2006. I wrote an op-ed piece. I argued that we needed right then 30,000 more troops in Afghanistan. We needed a good counterinsurgency strategy. The problem is, as I saw it, by the time Obama became president, it was too late, that we'd basically lost southern Afghanistan. And you could clear out during the day, but you couldn't hold the night and so forth. Basically, in my opinion, we have committed to an unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and the basic strategy of counterinsurgency is inherently contradictory in that we have no credible partner that we're operating on behalf. We have, and I'm talking specifically about Karzai and the Karzai administration, U.S. officials are no longer allowed to suggest that. We read in the newspaper, but most outsiders can say it freely, and I just did. We have insufficient troops. I mean, 30,000 extra troops is nowhere near enough relative to what even the U.S. Army counterinsurgency manual says you need for good counterinsurgency operations. More likely, you probably need a total of NATO and Afghan troops of about 500,000 if you really want to do this right. One thing that's concerned me in particular is that as we surge into the combat operations in southern Afghanistan, that we are pushing the Taliban more into a global jihadist posture, and that we are also, when we clear them out, we push them over the border into Pakistan. And from Pakistan, they can get on airplanes, they can do things. From Afghanistan, they really can't. I mean, they can go across the border, but that really concerns me. And I think that this has started to concern a lot of people as they're kind of hedging on whether they're going to do this big operation in Kandahar or not. You also have just woeful problems in terms of Army and especially police training in Afghanistan. And the whole premise, the whole context of why we were surging was based on two additional key ideas. One would be that we would have a core civilian capacity ready to move into place. Well, that doesn't exist in the US government. It's grown from about 300 to about 900 or so, but that's not what you need. You need much more than that. It doesn't exist in terms of the, as we've seen in Marja, in terms of the Afghan government ready to kind of pack up and have government in a box, as General McChrystal described it. Ironically, it could have existed, I think, in NATO had we tried to build it over the last few years, but we didn't. And indeed, it could and should and is at the central mission of the European Union to be able to do this kind of civilian activity. And I think we've continually lost an opportunity in the transatlantic architecture to really enhance the civilian projection capacity of the EU. And then finally, the other premise was that if we sent more troops to Afghanistan, then just because we did, then the Europeans will too, right? And that really didn't happen. In fact, you got the Dutch, Canadians also moving out. And we don't know who's going to replace those troops. We have no idea. So that gets into the NATO piece, because you have real problems in NATO itself in terms of the kind of war that it's fighting. It has no experience with counterinsurgency historically. It has good experience in places like Bosnia with peace support operations. And in my view, had we used NATO wisely back in 2001, 2003, similar to like we did in Bosnia, that might have worked. But remember, in Bosnia, we came in with 60,000 troops. And then following that came the World Bank and the IMF and the EU and this architecture that was ready to go and really build the civilian side that needed to be built. And as many probably know here, Bosnia's still got issues, right? I mean, they have some challenges, politically in particular. So that NATO piece of the puzzle is set in Afghanistan, that one reason we have to stay in Afghanistan is because NATO's future is at stake if NATO fails. And I would posit, and I don't like saying this, I truly don't, but I think NATO has already failed in Afghanistan, and we just haven't admitted it yet. And that's a failure, quite frankly, not of the European allies. I mean, they could do more, they should do more, we can ask them to do more, but why will they? I don't think so. So the failure was really in Washington to recognize these new basic realities of what's going on in the world. So then you have this strategy review that talks about none of this that I just described. As I said, it's a document, it's a recommendation to the Secretary General, but it's basically a NATO team making recommendations for more things for NATO to do. As I said, there's a lot of other options that they could be doing here. And so you get this May 2010 document. And let me just give you a couple quick content pieces from it with a little bit of comment. And then I'll make some recommendations and conclude, because I really want to get into much more detailed discussion here. But the document that Secretary Albright produced with her team says, quote, "Economic headaches can distract attention from security needs." See, I think that's completely inverted. The economic situation in the world is the security issue in the world today. I mean, that's what will create instability. That's what's causing people pain in Ireland and in New York and America. It's the economic crisis globally. So to say the economic headaches can distract attention from security needs, I think that's just a fundamental misreading of what are the security needs of people in the 21st century. It says the alliance embodies the transatlantic link. Well, if that's true, then it's not a very healthy link at this point. As one very pro-NATO friend of mine said in a public speech he gave in Ohio a few years ago, Ron Asmus, and he is a good friend, he said, if NATO were stock, I'd be selling. And in my view, it hasn't gotten better in the few years since. And not only that, but the alliance doesn't only embody the transatlantic link, so does the EU, so does the US bilateral relationships with all these countries, so does the US-Ireland relationships with all the businesses across, the interparliamentary groups. I mean, there's lots going on. It's not just all about NATO, and this room knows that very well. It says the alliance success depends on the equitable sharing among members of roles, risks, and responsibilities. That's never been the case. I mean, in the entire history of NATO, that's never been the case. Because, you know, during the height of the Cold War, the U.S. spent 6% of GNP on defense, and Europe spent on average 3%. Europe is going, you know, we saw the announcement of British plans for cuts. I mean, if the British are going to cut as much as they're talking about in defense spending, you know, and they're doing a wise thing, I think, in my view. But we can't, how can we go to the British and say you should spend more on defense when you're suffering economically? That's tough to do. And that's true across Europe as well. It says Afghanistan is, it doesn't talk really about Afghanistan. It just says, quote, it's a rich source of lessons learned. And I have a few ideas on what those lessons are, but the bottom line is, as Colin Powell once said, you don't fight wars you can't win. At least if you, and when you go, you have an exit strategy, you have a plan. You have a serious way in and a serious way out. As it stands right now, even if the current plan were to work, and I do not think it can, then I also have an alternative there, and I'm glad to talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But even if it were to work, in the best case, we're talking about large numbers of U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan for at least another 5, more likely 10 years. And there will be fighting, because the Taliban don't go away. So the idea that you can withdraw or draw down combat forces is very unlikely in that regard. Very little in this document on enlargement. It seems to have run its course. But as we were talking earlier, this shows part of the problem here. As I understand it, we were offered a deal by Moscow in 2008 in the spring. Basically, if we would back off Ukraine, they would put increased effort towards sanctions on Iran. Now, we say Iran's the biggest problem right now. I don't think it is, but they say Iran's the biggest problem. Well, that's true. Then, you know, we never, in my opinion, I can say this because I'm an academic, in my assessment, we were never serious about having Ukraine come into NATO. There was no consensus in NATO. It wasn't likely to happen. So we weren't really going to do it. But we said, no, we don't do deals. We don't take that deal. So now, a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine says, well, we're not going to try for NATO anymore. The parliament passes a rule and says, no more. We're going to be neutral, you know, and we're staying out. Well, so what did we get from that? I mean, we meaning the United States. Nothing. So it doesn't, that doesn't suggest to me a really good capacity for prioritization relative to the challenges that we confront. The document calls for a truly comprehensive partnership between NATO and the EU, and then says absolutely nothing about how to achieve that. So I don't even know what that means. And finally, it talks about climate change in the very last paragraph, and then again says virtually nothing about that as well. Okay, so I want to just use about 5-6 more minutes, so that's the problem to me. I think this is not serious strategic planning, because that requires setting a sense of what the environment really is and how do we want to get to a better place if we can. And then how do you align your tactics to support your achieving that goal. Well, my basic argument, and I do have an argument here, and I would be glad to be challenged on this and told why it's wrong. But my argument is that NATO should be kept as a reserve capacity, basically keep the treaty. Article 5, collective defense, territorial integrity, planning, hedging basically against future geopolitical rivalry at the large end. The classic functions of NATO, the Germans down, the Russians out, America in. That doesn't require costly new initiatives. It doesn't require a lot of personnel and staff. It requires leadership, basically, and agreement on directions of where to go. So in that sense, NATO really ought to be a reserve fund of power, held back for emergencies, in effect. It would then be fundamentally political in nature and could use the political dynamic to do certain kinds of things, like continuing to integrate Russia. Which is really the big chunk of what has to still happen here. Now, then I argue, and I said this in this op-ed at foreignpolicy.com, that the NATO staff in Brussels should instead be given a clear mandate to work themselves out of a job. Now, these are friends of mine, so I'm a little reluctant to say that, but now the good news for people in the EU, and that includes a large chunk of this room, is that my goal is that the EU would then get those jobs and be busier in the process. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The idea being that the United States needs to make the final and key mission of NATO to begin handing over full responsibility for the European area to the European Union. And that is a fairly provocative conclusion, in Washington too, I should say, among the 6 or 7 of us who talk about NATO on a regular basis. And I should say, I don't mean that as jest. I mean, NATO in Washington is not a big deal. People aren't talking about it. They talk about it to the extent that it is relevant to Afghanistan. And that's really about it at this point. We're not talking about enlargement. We're not talking about Eastern Europe and so on. So by jealously hanging on to a costly and increasingly irrelevant dominance over European security policy, the U.S. hinders, arguably, effective EU security integration, and ironically damages America's own interests in the process. And then I ask, if the U.S. can't hand over lead authority in Europe, where in the world can it? And to me, that's a really important point, because if you go back to the issue of overstretch, overreach, our budgets, if we can't come back out of Europe at this point, if we can't say mission accomplished, if we can't say this is good in Europe, it's working, where possibly can we begin to do this? It has to start somewhere. But I think that my argument is these things are happening anyway. So far better would be to have a plan, a strategic plan, to facilitate it, work it cooperatively over 5 to 10 years, not something that would be a quick break or appeal to the isolationist sentiment in the United States that is growing. Rather, instead, really make a clear statement that this is a goal of the United States, to work closely with Europe to facilitate this process. And then to really focus on the EU-US bilateral architecture, including all the EU countries in that dynamic. So before committing to this strategic concept, I've been arguing where I can that, in fact, the United States needs to do its own policy review of the entire operation here, and that every country has their own interest and right to do those things as well. Now, the European Union, as people well know, is at this point, people say, not capable of standing alone. Not good at force projection and so forth. But as everyone well knows, it does have a sizable amount of troops. It does have 2 nuclear powers. It can establish the long-term, long-range logistics. There are satellite systems and so forth. These strategic shifts can't happen overnight, but they will never happen if the U.S. does not make the building of the European Union and not NATO its primary strategic goal in the transatlantic relationship. Now, I want to conclude, though, with a historical perspective on this. I'm not a historian, but I like historians. So, I think history actually tells us a lot about this, and just in 2 minutes, and then I'll wrap up. A lot of the people working NATO policy in the 90s when I was in government were kind of joking about we're present at the creation. I mean, and a lot of people felt like we were, because we were enlarging NATO, building this bridge to Eastern Europe and so forth. The Cold War was over. But if we really want to talk about that, we should go back and look at the actual founding of NATO. And I think it tells us a lot. When NATO was founded in 1949, it was at its most high level of military vulnerability to conventional war, right? Because you had all these Soviet troops and very little in the West. So at the #1 time, between about 1949 and 1952, NATO was literally very vulnerable. But at its most vulnerable time, its main function was really political. not military. NATO only got militarized after the Korean War, and then the division of Berlin and so forth. And so its main function was political. I just can't see an argument why that couldn't be the case today relative to the nature of threats in the world. Secondly, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State at the time, he said, quote, NATO was conceived as a pre-integration organization aimed to produce plans for uncoordinated and separate action in the hope that in the event of trouble, a plan and forces to meet it would exist and would be adopted by a sort of spontaneous combustion. That clearly, in his view, didn't require, thousands of U.S. Senior military officers and headquarters all around Europe and so forth. It was basically thought to be a planning organization. Eisenhower, the first Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he made a comment in 1950 that if NATO is still here in 5 years, the entire project will have been a failure. In other words, his vision of it was the purpose is to get Europe on its feet so it can take care of itself, right? And then finally, George Kennan, who was himself a historian and a scholar and the father of containment. In the internal, I wrote my dissertation on this for my PhD. In the internal debates over NATO, he's the father of containment, but he opposed the creation of NATO. And I'll just conclude with two quotes of his. He says, quote, "There is a danger we will deceive ourselves and permit misconceptions to exist among our public and in Europe concerning the significance of such a pact at this time. The North Atlantic Security Pact will affect the political war only insofar as it operates to stiffen the self-confidence of the West Europeans in the face of Soviet pressure. But it goes hand in hand with the danger of a general preoccupation with military affairs to the detriment of economic recovery and the necessity for seeking a peaceful solution to Europe's difficulties." The second thing he warned was that instead of an ability to divest ourselves gradually from the basic responsibility for the security of Western Europe, we will get a legal perpetuation of that responsibility. In the long run, such a legalistic structure must crack up on the rocks of reality. For a divided Europe is not permanently viable, and the political will of the U.S. people is not sufficient to enable us to support Western Europe indefinitely as a military appendage. So I'm arguing that rather than having this break up on the rocks of reality, we should have a real strategic plan, that not something that is driven, with all due respect, by a small insular group of people that are hired by NATO to write more work for NATO. So I'll conclude with that, and hopefully I've been provocative and we can have some discussion. I should say, by the way, a former student of mine is here in the room from America, so she's probably the first to go after me.
Thank you very much.